Hi guys, welcome back. In the last session, we have seen how to develop a REST API, which will deal with both GET request and POST request, consumes and produces. So we developed one application called eRail application. Assume that it is the IRCTC application. It is having two endpoints. One is for booking the ticket. Another one is to get the ticket. Okay. So this application development is completed and we are able to test that application by using Postman. Okay, now once our application is ready to provide the services, other applications should access services from our application. Now our application is called as provider application. So we are ready to provide the services to the other applications. Now let's consider a scenario. My project is ready. I have developed one eRail API. This is used to book train tickets. Now, in this application, I am having two endpoints. Endpoint 1 is available. Endpoint 2 is available. Endpoint 1 is used to book the ticket. Endpoint 2 is used to provide the ticket data. Now, once this application is available, anybody who is doing business dealing with me, they can access my services. So this eRail application, we can call as a provider application. We are providing services to other applications. Anybody in the market who want to book the train tickets in their project, they can do business dealing with me. So I developed this project. Assume that I have spent 1 year of time. I invested a lot of money and finally I'm able to complete ticket booking system in project. Now, Make My Trip people has called me. Make My Trip people want to develop a project. In that project, they want to provide train ticket booking facility. So this is Make My Trip. Now, they want to access my application to book the tickets. Because to book the tickets, lot of complex logic we have to develop that we have already developed from the last 1 year, and we spent lot of time and we invested a lot of money to do that operation. Now, Make My Trip people also want to do the same thing. Make My Trip people want to do the same thing. Got it? Now here, Make My Trip people, instead of redeveloping the logic, they want to reuse the logic. So whenever customer accessing the Make My Trip application to book a ticket, instead of executing the logic in the Make My Trip people will send a request to my application. My application will process the request and will send the response. Here, Make My Trip application will send a request to my application and my application will process the request and will send the response to the Make My Trip application. So now here, IRCTC application developed by one company, Make My Trip developed by another company. This is client application for us. This client application should send a request to the IRCTC application. IRCTC application will do the ticket booking and IRCTC will send the response to the Make My Trip. So this is called provider application and this is called consumer application. Guys, see here, provider and consumer both are developed by same company or they are developed by different companies. IRCTC project is developed which contains the logic to book the tickets. Make My Trip application is available, which contains the logic to accept the request and give the data to the IRCTC. IRCTC will book the ticket. IRCTC will give the response to the Make My Trip. So who is service provider and who is a service consumer? In this scenario, who is a service provider and who is a service consumer? IRCTC is the provider. IRCTC is provider. And Make My Trip is the consumer. Now here, in this scenario, guys, assume that IRCTC application developed by a company called TCS. Make My Trip project developed by a company called Infosys. Okay. IRCTC project developed by TCS. Make My Trip project developed by Infosys. Now, here, guys, assume that I am from the Make My Trip. I am from the IRCTC development. I developed this project. I have tested this project. Everything is working as expected. Then what about this Infosys company project, Make My Trip? So here there are some developers available to access IRCTC. I am from the IRCTC team. You are from the Make My Trip team. You are the developer in the Make My Trip project. I am the developer in the IRCTC project. Assume that my name is Ashok. I have developed this IRCTC project and your name is some Raja. You are working on this Make My Trip application. As a IRCTC developer, I got the requirement. I understand the requirement. I developed it. I tested. Everything is working fine. Now you need to access IRCTC. But here you are working in the Infosys company. I'm working in the TCS company. I worked on the IRCTC development. You are working on the Make My Trip development. Now here, as you are going to develop Make My Trip application and you are going to access IRCTC application, do you know what is the URL of the IRCTC application? Do you know what data you need to send in the request to book the ticket? Do you know in which format you need to send the request to the IRCTC? Do you know what response you can get? Do you know in which format you are going to get the response? So do you need the details or you don't need those details? Now here, as a Ashok, I have developed this IRCTC. Now you are Raja, you are developing Make My Trip. So to develop this client application, you need to know what is endpoint URL. What is the endpoint URL of IRCTC? Make My Trip should send the request to which URL? What is the endpoint URL? What is the request method? Request is binded to get request or post request. What is request method? What is input data? What is input? What is output? What is input? What is output? What are the media types? What are the media types? So now here, as a client developer, you should know all these details. Do you have this information about the IRCTC to access the IRCTC, guys? As a client-side developer, always you should have the information about the provider. What information we need about the provider? What is the endpoint URL? What is the URL of the IRCTC? IRCTC developed by TCS. That application is running. They have tested. Everything is fine. Now, you need to develop your client logic to access IRCTC. In order to develop the client logic, what is client? The application which is accessing services of the other application is called as a client. Now, in order to develop this client, you should have endpoint URL. What request you need to send? Is it a get request or is it a post request? In the request to book the ticket, what information you need to send? Passenger data, what fields required for the passenger data? What is input? What is output? What is input data format? What is output data format? IRCTC expecting what input data? IRCTC will provide what output data? IRCTC is expecting input in which format? IRCTC can provide output in which format? What is the URL of the IRCTC API? What is the request method available in the IRCTC API? Client should know all this information. Then only we can access the other application. So provider development completed by one company. Client development is doing by another company. If a client is developing, if you are developing the client application to access the provider, you should know provider information. What is the endpoint URL of the provider? So what is the URL of the provider? So in the provider, how many endpoints available? Those endpoints are binded to which HTTP method? What is the input data structure? What is output data structure? What data provider is expecting as input? What data provider is giving as output? In which format provider will take the input? In which format provider will give the output? What formats provider supporting for input? What formats provider supporting for output? Do you know those details? Guys, do you know those details now? As a client-side developer, you should know these details, or without knowing these details, can you access IRCTC? As a client-side developer, you should know these details, or without knowing these details also, can you communicate from your application to other application? Whenever we are developing the web services or RESTful services, two actors will be available. One actor is called as a provider, another actor is called as a consumer. Provider developed by one company, consumer is developing by another company. The application which is providing the services to other company is called as provider. The application which is consuming services from others is called as consumer. So provider developed. IRCTC developed the logic to book the tickets. Make My Trip want to access that logic. If Make My Trip wants to communicate with the IRCTC, Make My Trip side development team should know which URL they have to use to send the request to IRCTC. What is the endpoint URL? What is the request method? What data they need to send from Make My Trip to IRCTC to book the ticket? In which format they need to send the data? What data IRCTC will provide? In which format IRCTC will provide the data? Client-side developer should know all these details. Okay. Client-side dev team needs what is endpoint URL. That means which application we need to access. What is the URL of that application? What data we need to send in the request? What data we will get in the response? All this information client-side development team should know. I mean to say, Make My Trip people are acting as client for the IRCTC. Make My Trip side development team should know all this information. Who will provide all this information? Provider only should provide this information. I am the provider. I have developed my project. What input I need, what output I need, what is my URL, what data I will support for input, what data I will support for output. That information I know. That information my client don't know. For my client, I need to provide that information. That's where here guys, what provider will do is, provider will give documentation for the client. That is called doc. So provider side development team should generate the documentation. That the documentation will be given to the client side development team. What is this documentation? This documentation contains provider information. Who is our provider? Where is our provider? What is the URL of the provider? What information provider is expecting in the request? What information provider will give in the output? What data provider can take as input? What data provider can provide as output? All that information provider will keep in the documentation. That documentation will be given to the client-side development team. Based on this documentation, client-side logic will be developed to access the provider. To generate this documentation, provider will use Swagger. What is that, guys? Provider is going to use what? Provider will use Swagger. What is that Swagger? Swagger is used to provide documentation about the REST API. Whatever the REST API I have developed, my clients want to access my REST API. In order to access my REST API, they should know my API details. Where is my API? What is the URL of my API? What is the request I'm expecting? What type of request I'm expecting? What input I'm expecting? In which format I'm expecting input? What output I will provide? In which format I can provide the output? All my API details should be documented. That a document we need to send it to the client-side development team. Based on the documentation given by the provider, client-side development will happen. How to send the documentation about our API to our client application side team? For that, Swagger we are going to use to generate the documentation. Are you guys able to understand? What is the documentation? Why we need to generate the documentation about our API? Whatever the API I have developed, it will be accessed by other company project. So my development team developed IRCTC project. So Make My Trip should access my API. Yatra people should access my API. GoIBO people should access my API. Redbus people access my API. So if they want to access my API, they should know about my API. So they should know the details about my API. So I should provide my API details to my client side teams. So Make My Trip is my client. I am providing services to the Make My Trip by taking some money from the Make My Trip. For every ticket booking in the IRCTC through Make My Trip will pay the amount to the IRCTC. Okay, guys. Like for every ticket 10 rupees or 15 rupees, like that, they will have a margin. So that is the reason Make My Trip application is providing the facility for the train ticket booking, but internally Make My Trip will communicate with the IRCTC. For every request Make My Trip is sending for the IRCTC will charge some amount. That is called business to business communication. IRCTC developed by one company, Make My Trip is developed by another company. So if Make My Trip people want to develop the client logic to access IRCTC, Make My Trip people should know about the API, IRCTC API. So who will provide the IRCTC API details to the Make My Trip? We should provide, because we are from the provider team. Provider side development team should provide the provider documentation to the client side development team. Based on the documentation, client side development team will understand the API, will understand the business requirement, will understand the API details, will develop the client logic. Using that client logic, they will send a request to the API. So here in the REST APIs, documentation will play very, very, very important role. Are you guys clear? What is the documentation? Who need documentation? Who should provide the documentation? Who needs documentation about the API? Provider needs the documentation or client side team needs the documentation? Client side team needs the documentation. Why? Client side team needs the documentation. Why client side team needs the documentation? Why client side team needs the documentation? Client side team should access the API. So client side team should know the API details. So who should provide the documentation here? Who is responsible to provide the documentation now? Client people will create their own documentation. Huh? Provider team should provide the documentation. Huh? Provider team should provide the documentation. Nowadays, how providers are providing the documentation to the clients? How providers are providing the documentation to the clients? How providers are providing the documentation to the clients? By using Swagger. What is the Swagger? Swagger is used to generate the documentation for the REST API. Okay, guys. Now, so here, let's understand what is Swagger. We are understanding Swagger. In REST API, two actors will be available. In distributed applications, two actors will be available. Two actors will be available. One is called as provider. Second one is called as consumer. So provider is developing by, provider will be developed by one company. Provider will be developed by one company. Consumer will be developed by another company. Consumer will be developed by another company. If a consumer wants to access the provider, consumer side dev team should know provider information. What information? What is provider URL? What is provider API URL? What is the provider API URL? What methods available in the provider? What operations provider is giving? Operation nothing but method. What operations provider having? Okay. Operation binded to what type of request? Is it a GET request or POST request? Operation is binded to GET or POST request. Operation is binded to which request type? What input provider is expecting from client? What input provider expecting from client? What output provider will give to client? Provider is expecting from consumer, basically I can say. What output provider will give to consumer? Which formats provider is supporting for input and output? Which data format provider will support for input and output, for input and output. Now you see here guys, when we are going for distributed applications, two actors will be available. One is provider and another one is consumer. Provider will be developed by one company, consumer will be developed by another company. If a consumer wants to access provider, consumer side dev team should know provider information. What information? What is provider API URL? What operations provider is having? Operation means methods, guys. REST API methods are called as operations. Operations are binded to which request type? Get request or post request or put or delete? Get or post or put or delete. These are the common request methods that we are going to use in the REST API. So book ticket. Book ticket is binded to get request or post request or put request or delete request. What input? Passenger data required. But what information needs in the passenger? Name, Aadhaar card, PAN card, date of birth, gender, journey date, start date, and from station to station. That information is required. Okay. What output provider will give? Ticket data. What data will come in the ticket? Right? Which formats they will support. So all this information, if client side, if consumer side dev team knows, if consumer side dev team having all the above information, then only they can start consumer side development. Okay. Provider is developing by one company. Their API is ready. Their code is working. Tested, everything is okay, but make my trip should access. How to access? Information is required. If a consumer side dev team having all the above information, then only they can start the consumer side development. Provider should provide, provider side dev team should provide API documentation to consumer side dev team. Okay, guys. Provider should provide the API documentation to the consumer side dev team. To generate the documentation, Swagger is used to generate API documentation. Swagger is a third-party library, not from Java. Swagger is not from the Spring Boot also. Swagger is a third-party library which is used to generate REST API documentation. Okay, guys. So provider side dev team should provide the API documentation to consumer side dev team. So to generate the documentation, to share the documentation, Swagger we are going to use. Swagger is used to generate the API documentation. Swagger is a third-party library which is used to generate REST API documentation. Using Swagger documentation, consumer side dev team will understand provider API information. Okay, guys, you understand what is the Swagger now? When we are developing the distributed applications, two actors will be available. One application is called as a provider, another application is called as consumer. Provider will be developed by one company, consumer will be developed by another company. Okay, so when provider and consumer are developing by two companies, consumer should know the provider data. This information is required for the consumer, then only they can write the logic to access the provider. So consumer side dev team need that information. Provider only should give that information about their provider data. Okay, so in order to provide such kind of information, we are going to use a concept called Swagger. So what is a Swagger? Swagger is used to generate API documentation. Swagger is a third-party library which is used to generate REST API documentation. Using Swagger documentation, consumer side dev team will understand provider side API information. Okay, now let me go for this e-rail application. In this application only, I want to add the Swagger and I want to show you Swagger documentation. Okay, guys. Now currently, we don't have any Swagger in our project. Now let me configure Swagger in this project. Let me configure Swagger in the project. So working procedure. Steps to add the Swagger documentation for REST API. Steps to add Swagger documentation for REST API. Okay. Add the Swagger dependencies in the pom.xml. The first step that you need to do, add Swagger and Swagger UI dependencies in project pom.xml. Okay. Second one, create Swagger config class to generate documentation. To generate the documentation. Access Swagger document, run the application and access Swagger documentation. Are you guys clear? What is the Swagger? Why we are going for Swagger? You got the clarity now? Guys, did you get the clarity? What is the Swagger and why we need to go for Swagger? So what is the Swagger? Why we are going for Swagger? Provider information should be shared to the consumer side development team. For that, we are going for Swagger. Swagger is a third-party API which is used to generate the documentation for the REST API. How to add the Swagger documentation to the REST API? Simple. You need to add Swagger and Swagger UI dependencies in the project pom.xml. You need to add Swagger and Swagger UI dependencies in the project pom.xml. Create one Swagger configuration class to generate the documentation. Run the application and access Swagger documentation in browser. Now, let's do that. Go to our mvnrepository.com. Let me get the Swagger dependency. mvnrepository.com. Go for Swagger. Click on Core Swagger, Swagger Fox, Swagger UI. Okay. Swagger 3.0.0 is available. Let me take the Swagger dependency. Okay. Web Starter is available, DevTools available, Lombok is available. Along with this, I'm going to use the Swagger UI. Swagger dependency I have added. Okay. Now, along with this, Swagger UI and Swagger also will be available. Swagger Fox is available, Swagger Core and Swagger dependency. Swagger annotations, Swagger UI dependency is available. Let me check, is there any other pom.xml that is required? Spring Fox Swagger. Spring Fox Swagger UI is available directly. Swagger 2. Yeah. Spring Fox Swagger 2 is available. Let me take this dependency. Okay. Now go to pom.xml, Swagger and Swagger UI. Both dependencies I am adding. Fine. Once we have added Swagger dependencies, let us create one Java class that is called Swagger config class to generate the documentation. New class I'm using in.ashokit.config. This class is used for Swagger configuration. I'm using Swagger config annotation. Okay. So to represent this class as a Swagger configuration class, we need to write some annotation and we need to tell to the Swagger config class which classes it has to consider for the documentation. So for that, we are going to use one annotation called @configuration. So I'm representing this class as a configuration class. Then I'm going for enable Swagger. I want to tell that enable Swagger configuration. This class I want to represent as a configuration class, and I want to enable Swagger for this class. Let me go for that. Enable Swagger. Okay. Configuration and enable Swagger. Then next one, I need to write one method, public docket API doc method. So this method I am representing as @bean. So this method should be called by IOC. IOC container will call my method. My method will return the docket object. What is this docket object? This docket object is used to represent for which classes you want to generate the documentation. So do we need to generate the documentation for all the classes in the project, or we need to generate the documentation for only REST controller in the project? Guys, do we need to generate the documentation for all the classes in the project, or we need to generate the documentation for only REST controller in the project? Only for the REST controller. That customization we are going to do by using the docket object. Okay, I don't want IOC container to create the object for the docket. I will create the object for the docket. IOC should call my method and it should represent a docket as a Spring Bean. So let me create it. Return new docket. Return new docket. For the docket, I'm going to specify documentation type dot Swagger. Documentation type dot Swagger. Now after this, I'm going to specify new docket dot select and dot APIs request handler selectors dot base package, which package it has to scan, in dot ashok it dot rest package it has to scan, dot paths. In that package, path can be anything. Path selectors dot any dot build. So this is my Swagger configuration class. So what I am telling here, hey Swagger, you create the docket object and you select the REST APIs which are available, REST controllers which are available in this package. Path can be anything, not only get request method, not post request method, any method which is available in the REST controller which are part of this package. For those classes, you generate the documentation. That is the meaning of that. If you want, I will write it once again. Observe. API doc is available. I need to create a docket object. In the docket object, I need to specify where my REST controllers are available, in which package my REST controllers are available. In the REST controllers, for which methods we need to create the documentation. Right. Return new docket of documentation type dot Swagger. Then select which packages you select dot APIs. That means where is your REST API? What are the REST controllers available? In which package they are available? You select it by using request handler selectors dot base package. REST controllers are available in one package, in dot ashok it dot REST package. Dot paths. What is the URL pattern for the REST controller methods? It can be any. So the path is not important. Either it can be get or it can be post or put or delete. It can be anything. You consider all the methods in the REST controllers from that package and you build the documentation. That is the meaning of this Swagger config. That's it. We are done with the configuration, guys. I have added Swagger dependencies in the pom.xml and I have created the Swagger configuration class. Now run the application and access the documentation of our project in the browser. Let me go for this project, same project which I have created yesterday. I'm taking this project. Let me do the clean update, Maven clean update, force update the project so that it will download the dependencies properly. Now run this application, run as a boot application. Run as boot application. Clear the console and check it. If there is any issue, we need to fix it. If there is no issue, I will show you the documentation. Application is getting started. I have a Spring Boot application. In that REST controller is available and I have added the Swagger also in the project. Yeah, it failed. There is an error. Now we are getting java.lang.null pointer exception, application context, failed to start the bean, documentation plugin bootstrapper, nested exception is lang exception. Okay, let's take it. Take this exception, go to browser, Google, ask Google, did anybody face it the same exception? What is the solution? Yes, our favorite, Stack Overflow. They are saying that they also got the same problem. Documentation plugin bootstrapper. How to resolve this problem? So by adding this in the properties file, we can resolve this. I got the same issue, Swagger and Swagger UI, boot version. The way to resolve this issue by using path matcher in the properties file or YML file. By adding path matcher, we can resolve this issue. That is what they are saying. Same thing. Here, let us take this path matcher and path matcher. So here, Swagger is not, because of the version mismatch, Swagger is not able to identify the path matcher. That's why we are getting this issue. We are going to configure path matcher in the properties file. Let us update this project again. Maven force update. Update the project. Now clear it. Now run as boot application. This time my application started successfully. Tomcat started with the port number 8080. So in this application, we are having Swagger. So with this, our project is started. Added the Swagger dependencies and created the configuration class. I got one problem with the path matching. I resolved it by adding this property. Now, how to add this, how to access our Swagger documentation now? Okay, let us go for our project, localhost : 8080 / swagger-ui.html. Swagger-ui.html. When I access swagger-ui.html, I'm facing some issue. So the Swagger documentation page is not open for me. Okay, localhost : initializing the dispatcher servlet, I'm not able to access this Swagger documentation. v2 / API-docs. Right. v2 / API docs. I'm trying to access the documentation of the API. It is giving the URL as Apache license. Localhost is the base path. Localhost : 8080, base path is equal to /. Okay, guys. Now let me check it. Is there any mistake that I have done? Config, swagger config.java, in.ashokit.rest. Package name was incorrect. I have given in.ashokit.rest. Now I have corrected that package. Now let me go for localhost : 8080 / swagger-ui.html. No message available. I'm not getting that response. API docs working. Yes, guys. Now you see the API documentation got generated. If I take this documentation, now see, to get the documentation, so localhost : 8080 / v2 / API docs. When I send the request to the API docs URL, it is giving some documentation in the JSON format. Let me take this JSON. And let me create one JSON file here to show you how the JSON is looking like. New file doc.json. One JSON file I have created. Paste it. Ctrl+Shift+F. So this is our Swagger documentation. What is the host URL where your API is running? Currently, my API is running in the same machine. That's why it is giving localhost. What is the port number? 8080 is the port number. What are the paths available in this API? /ticket one path available. It is binded to post request. This can consume the data in the XML or JSON. So post request method is available. Its URL pattern is /ticket. It can consume the data in the XML format, in the JSON format, and it will produce the data in the XML format or JSON format. These are the parameters. Okay. And response status code it can give. And there is another method, ticket. It is binded to get request. So it is not consuming anything. It is only producing the XML or JSON. Ticket ID, get request method is binded to /ticket. It is having path parameter. And it is producing XML or JSON. Parameters, ticket ID is required, response type, definition. Passenger data is the input. In the passenger data, these properties consumer should send. Date of journey, first name, from, last name, to address, train number. And ticket is the response. Ticket data will contain from ticket ID, ticket status, ticket cost to train number. So here, these are the information. So now can you see here, the complete API documentation is available in the JSON format or not? Guys, come on. Are you able to see the complete API information in the JSON format or not? What are the methods are available? What is the URL of the API? What are the methods available? What is the URL pattern? They are binded to post request or get request. What input they are expecting? What get request can produce the data in this format? Post request can take the data in this format, can produce the data in this format. What data they need in the input, passenger data, what fields are required in the passenger data, what fields they will send in the ticket data. They will provide the documentation like this. Provider side team will provide the documentation to the consumer team. Based on this documentation, consumer team will write the logic to access the provider. And one more thing is, I have added the UI dependency swagger-UI /index.html. No, man, it's not working. Swagger, I should get some UI page also, guys. That UI page also will give you, the very clear details about that. Localhost :8080 /swagger-UI.html. User interface also will come for the documentation. I think because of the version issue, it is not coming. Currently, we are able to access V2 API docs. That JSON file is coming. So what is there in the JSON file? That JSON file is telling what is the host of the API, what is the base path, what are the methods available, they are binded to which request, what is the consuming format, what is the producing format, and what input they are expecting, what fields they are expecting in the input, what fields they are providing in the output. So the complete API information available in the JSON documentation or not? Come on, guys. The complete JSON documentation, complete API information coming in the JSON documentation or not? The complete API information is displaying in the JSON documentation. The complete API information is displaying in the JSON documentation. Let me do one small thing, guys. Let me go to the lower version and let me show you the UI page also. I think with the latest version, there is some issue. Let me go to the previous version and let me show you. The Spring Boot 2.5.6 version. Let me try 2.5.6 version of the Spring Boot. And Swagger 2.6.1 version. Just did a trial. I want to show you the look and feel of the UI. Yeah. I have changed the dependency versions. Let me update my project. Maven, update the project. Force update. Right. Let me run it again. Run as boot application. It is downloading the previous versions. Let us see. Application is getting started. Yes, guys. So our application is started now. Documentation plugin, it is able to identify. Now let's go and refresh this. Fine. Now I'm able to get API docs also coming and the Swagger UI page is also coming. So documentation I can access in the JSON file as well as I can access the documentation in the UI. If you go for this UI, clearly it is telling, see the beauty. When I go for the Swagger documentation, boss, you are having a eRail REST controller. In the eRail REST controller, there are two endpoints available. One is a /ticket, it is binded to post request. Another one is a /ticket with path parameter binded to get request. When I go for the post request, it is telling that response will come in this format in the XML. If you go for JSON, that means response content type. So IRCTC API can give you the response content in the JSON format or XML format. If you want XML response, you will get like this. If you want JSON response, it will give you like this. And passenger data, you need to send in the request body. So you can send the passenger data as a parameter content type, input data, JSON. If input data is JSON, this is the format. If input data is XML, this is the format. Now you can select it. Application/JSON, click on this. This is the input. Date of journey, I will give some value. And first name, I'm giving some value. And the last from, I'm giving some value HYD. Last name, Ashok Kumar, something like this. Okay. And to station, I'm giving as Pune. And here I'm giving train number, some value. So like this, I am sending a request in the JSON format. Okay. Then click on try it out. When I click on try it out, the request is sent to the REST API with this URL and we got the response also. The REST API can be tested from the Swagger and it is giving you the clear documentation, what all the operations are available in the REST API. And the REST API methods can be tested from this UI also. And get ticket is available. Get ticket, it is expecting ticket ID as an input. Some 1, 2, 3, 4, something like this. We'll click on try it out. Then the ticket response will come. So you can send the post request to your REST API. You can send the get request to the REST API. Now tell me, testing the REST API with the Postman is easy. Testing the REST API with the Swagger is easy. If you go for Postman, you need to type each and everything. But in the Swagger, they are giving you all the details. So there is a REST API. For the REST API, this is the documentation. In that REST API, there are two endpoints available. One is binded to get request. Another one is binded to post request. If you want to test it, you can click on this endpoint. They are telling what is the response value and what is the input value. You click on try it out. You can send the request to the REST API and you can get the response from the REST API. Are you able to follow me? How I am generating the documentation? Are you able to understand how I am getting the documentation? Yes. So what are the dependencies that I have added in my pom.xml? So here, the dependencies that I have added, some Swagger version. Okay. Add the Swagger UI and Swagger dependency. And I'm creating Swagger configuration class. What is there in the configuration class? I'm telling to generate the docket object for the given package classes. Run the application, access the documentation. Documentation you can access in two ways. One is JSON documentation and UI documentation. JSON doc URL. It will give you the JSON file. UI doc URL. If you want to go for UI documentation. So this is the URL that we will use for the UI documentation. Now, API side development team will give these documentation URLs to the client side team. By using these URLs, they will take our documentation and they will start the development. Are you guys clear with my point? Now, do you understand how we are using Swagger and what is the purpose of the Swagger? Swagger is used to generate the documentation. In how many ways Swagger is generating the documentation? It is generating the documentation in the JSON format, as well as it is generating the documentation in the UI format. Using this UI documentation, we can even test the REST API. Using Swagger UI, we can test a REST API functionality, just like Postman. How we are testing the REST API in the Postman? The same kind of testing can be done by using Swagger UI also. Using Swagger UI, we can test REST API functionality just like Postman. What is the procedure to add the Swagger documentation to the REST API? So the first thing is you need to add Swagger dependencies in the pom.xml. Okay, guys, Swagger dependencies. Then we need to create the Swagger configuration class. For that, we are writing some annotations and one method also we are writing. We are creating a docket object. In the docket object, we are telling for which package classes it has to generate the documentation. Then after we are running the application, we are accessing the documentation. To access the documentation, we are using JSON documentation as well as UI documentation. Using the Swagger UI documentation, we can test the REST API functionality like Postman. Using JSON, we can see only JSON documentation. Now, for the client-side team, we can provide the JSON documentation as well as we can provide the UI documentation also. Mostly we will provide the JSON documentation for them, not the UI. UI documentation we will use to test our functionality. Now, do you understand how Make My Trip will get the documentation of the IRCTC? Guys, now do you understand how Make My Trip will get the documentation of the IRCTC? Yes, I will upload these notes, guys. Anybody having any questions, now you can ask me. Anybody having any questions, now you can ask me. JSON doc file I added in the project just to show you how that JSON will look like. No need to add it. You can delete it. Okay, it's not mandatory. I added to show you the structure of the JSON. That's it. It's not mandatory to add. I opened that JSON documentation in the browser. It is difficult to understand here. That's why I pasted that in the file in the IDE and I have shown the format. That is just for understanding purpose. Okay. Anybody having any questions? Can you unmute your mic and you can speak out?
So sir, Swagger is the standard thing that you are using.
Yes, right. Whatever the REST APIs that we are developing nowadays, so Swagger documentation is the standard that companies are following to give the API information to the client. Without this documentation, clients cannot develop the logic to communicate with our API.
Okay. Sir, testing scenario is same, sir. Scenario, Postman and Swagger.
Yes, testing is same. Okay. Swagger UI will give you more advanced testing functionality, right? What are the methods available? What are the URL patterns available? More advanced testing will be available here. They will tell you what data you can send, what data they are sending, what input type they are supporting for input and output. All that information you will understand from this documentation. And you can test the functionality of the API from the Swagger UI. JSON documentation just to understand the API information. What methods, what URL patterns, what input, what output, what input structure, what output structure you will get from the JSON. Same thing will provided in the UI also, but you can even test the request. You can send, try it out. What is the meaning of try it out? It will send the request to the API and it will get the response also. Testing also we can do from the Swagger UI.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
And sir, Insomnia is also similar thing because in my company they are using something like Insomnia.
I have no idea on that, man.
Okay.
Sir, Insomnia is just like Postman, sir. It is another tool.
Okay.
Same, exactly. It's not same as Swagger, but it's same as Postman.
Yes. Yeah, it's same like Postman.
Yes,
okay. I will research on that. Man, I have never used that. In my company, we are using Postman.
Sir, one of the provider they are given in the form of YAML, .YAML, and they asked us to open it in the using the editor. That is a Swagger editor.swagger.io.
Okay.
So YAML also, can we generate the documentation YAML also, sir?
No, sir. The Swagger it is giving JSON YML. No, I did not work with that YML documentation.
If they have given.
Some people, what they will do, in some companies, right? They will prepare one PDF document with the information and they will share that document. That also is there. So this is the URL, this is the method, this is the input, this is output. They will prepare one PDF document and they will share it. So it's project to project that documentation structure will be different, but the Swagger is the standard structure. Because based on our classes, it will generate the documentation. If you want to give in the PDF format, you need to write each and everything and you need to send to them.
Okay.
This is the method name, this is the URL, this is the input, this is the output, this field is mandatory, this field is optional, like that you have to tell them.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hi, sir. Sir, what if I develop 3 API? Okay, I want to share only 2 API to the provider, but not the whole 3 API. But my Swagger written all the 3 API details.
You have 3 methods in the REST API, but for the consumer, you want to expose only 2 methods, not the 3 methods.
Yeah.
Right. So you need to here, whatever the package names that we are giving, right? So whatever the class APIs that you want to expose, you keep in that package. Whichever you don't want to expose, you keep in a different package. Right here, based on the given package name, it will display. All the classes will not be displayed. The REST controllers which are available in this package only it will display. The REST controllers which are in the other package will not be displayed in the documentation. Okay. You can separate the packages.
Sir, what is docket, sir?
So docket is a predefined object will represent the Swagger documentation. So it is a predefined class in the Swagger library. Swagger is a third-party library. Docket is a predefined class.
Okay.
That class we are using to tell the Swagger for which classes it has to generate the documentation.
Okay. Thank you.
Here in paths, we can also like define some particular.
Yes. Suppose if you have some standard, the paths which are starting with some character A, only for them I want documentation, for remaining I don't want. Paths which are binded to get request, that customization you can do depends on the requirement.
Okay.
Here I'm giving selectors.any. What is the meaning of selectors.any? Path can be anything in the REST controller which are belongs to this package. For all the methods, documentation will be generated.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, my application is not taking at the rate of XML root elements. What's the reason, sir?
JAX-B dependency you need to add in the pom.xml. Because as I told several times, in the Java 9 version, they removed JAX-B. If you want to use the JAX-B from the Java 9 onwards, you need to add the JAX-B dependencies. 3-4 dependencies will be there. JAX-B core, JAX-B API, JAX-B annotations. Those dependencies you need to add in the pom.xml. Up to Java 8, no need to add it because JAX-B part of Java 8. In the Java 9, for modularity purpose, they removed it.
I'm using 1.8 Java version.
Yeah, you add the dependencies. If you're not getting, maybe you have selected build path Java 8, but in the compiler, different version may be available in the IDE. So add the dependency, then you will not face that problem.
Okay, thanks.
Sir, can I share my screen, show the YAML file, what I have got it?
In your project?
Yes.
Yes, sir. I have another class here, sir. We will look into that later.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Sir, there is only one class is available, docket class, for the creating the Swagger documentation.
Yes, in the Swagger, this is the standard class to create the documentation.
No, another class is available.
Swagger API contains several other classes also. Like API library, nothing but several classes will be available. For documentation, this class only we have to use. Okay.
Or is there any other use of this Swagger thing, like except API?
No. Two advantages with the Swagger. One is you can expose the API documentation. Second thing is you can test the API from the UI.
Okay.
These are the only 2 advantages.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Hello.
Yep.
Hello. Hi, Ashok sir. Okay. After adding data annotations, okay, in a ticket classes, okay, I am unable to find the setter and getter methods in controller classes. Okay.
Yeah, I understand that, sir. You have to install that Lombok jar file properly in your IDE. I will share a video for the Lombok installation. Okay.
No, I have added a Lombok dependency, okay, in pom.xml.
Listen, Kailash. If you just add the dependency in the pom.xml, Lombok will not work.
Okay.
After adding the dependency, you need to execute the Lombok jar file and you have to select your IDE location. Then only that Lombok will work. I will share you a video for that. How to
Okay.
install the Lombok in there. If you
Okay,
just
that-
add the dependency, it will not work.
Okay, that configuration is pending. Okay, so that it is not working.
Yes, right.
Okay, thank you.
Fine, guys. Thank you. So with this, I'm stopping for today. I want you people to practice this E-Rail API with the Swagger documentation, and we'll meet again in the Monday session. Monday, we will see how to do client development. As of now, we have done provider development and we are able to expose the documentation of the provider. Now we need to understand client development. Monday, we will see rest of client development. Thank you, guys. Good night. Have a great weekend. We'll meet on Monday.